Welcome to this talk on deepening your connection to nature. So let me just give you a little bit of my own background and bioinformation. My name again is Lee Burton. I'm the owner of naturaliststudies.com, and I'm also known as the outside professor if you're on Twitter, now known as X. You can look me up there. I'm also on other social media channels, including having a YouTube channel. And I'm an adjunct instructor at 3 different universities, so the University of Florida, Texas A&M, and also the University of Idaho, where I teach a variety of classes in animal behavior. And I'm certified in wildlife track and sign by the organization known as CyberTracker, who administers the evaluations. I'm also known as a bird language leaders instructor. So I was trained under John Young. He's the author of What the Robin Knows, and also actually started one of the main wilderness schools here in North America that's had many offshoots throughout the country. I'm trained in wilderness survival as well as foraging and some other what would be known as traditional ecological knowledge or sometimes primitive skills. And I'm also a master naturalist, so I'm really an all-arounder. Basically, anything has to do with the outdoors and naturalist studies I'm very interested in and always trying to learn more about. Let's take a look now at some fundamental concepts when we're discussing nature connection. So let's start with the definition of nature connection. And this is a commonly misunderstood or misappropriated term. It has different meanings to different people. So just to set the stage here and in terms of how I'm referring to it and that we're all on the same page with the same semantic definition, I want to go over this aspect of it. And first thing to understand is that it is greatly impacted by modernity. Our basically definition of it has really changed in recent years, decades, even the last several centuries. And previously, every culture on the planet, every ethnic group had it. So that may seem obvious, but I think we forget about that sometimes, that all of our ancestors, no matter where they came from, had a connection to the land, the waters, and a relationship to it, okay? Because it was essential for our well-being. We not only depended on nature for our survival and our sustenance, but everything we did was in nature, and a part of nature. And so because of that, we had a very deep connection to it. And it's only really in recent years where we've gotten, in some cases, almost entirely away from that, okay? And I happen to think that that can be or is a big negative, and a lot of studies show this because having a connection to nature is both relaxing, it's peaceful, and it has this meditative effect. And that's not just me saying this. Many studies have shown this, particularly in recent ones. And so it's something I think that's very important and that we have to take a look at from a societal standpoint. Richard Louv, who is the author of Last Child in the Woods, coined this term nature deficit disorder, and it's certainly been shown to be true in kids, that when you remove people from nature and having a connection to it, it definitely causes substantial dysfunction across the population. Again, doesn't matter your ethnicity, your background, and it's something that just we are built to have, and so when you remove it, it's deleterious. And part of the reason is that we oftentimes confuse some other activities outside with nature connection, okay? We oftentimes lump in educational programming or science curriculum, and again, nothing wrong with that. That's very valuable, but we often confuse that with nature connection. And really, that, while it's very good, is really just information, and information is not the same as connection. Okay, so that's something that to keep in mind always. And the other thing is recreation. I think in many cases when we talk about people being, an outdoors person, an outdoorsman, whatever the term is, we often think of it in terms of recreation, whether that's skiing or biking or running. It could be other activities, hunting as well, and fishing. But that's not the same as nature connection, although it can certainly facilitate it. And so I just want to clarify that nature connection goes beyond both of those. Okay. And I think John Young put it best when he said, reading about biceps or learning about nature is not the same as building biceps or connecting to nature. Okay. They're different things and they come about differently from engaging differently with nature. So let's take a look now at our relationship to nature and some of the components that are a part of that and define that. And the first thing that we want to note is that every culture, okay, really defines its relationship to nature, and they're all a little bit different. Now, some cultures are quite similar. So, for example, if you are from a tribe that lives in a rainforest region and still living a primitive existence, there's probably going to be a lot of similarities. And that's going to be different from someone that lives, let's say, in a temperate region or let's say in an Arctic region. Okay, their relationship to nature, because habitat, ecology, their diet is different, is going to be different. Okay, and you could say the same thing in modernity. If you grew up in the West or have moved there and you live in a cityscape, your relation to nature is going to be different from someone who grows up and lives on a farm. So there's absolutely a cultural component to that. And again, there's also a recreational aspect to nature. So again, many of us, when we think about nature, we think about playing in it, which is a wonderful aspect of it, okay? But it's only one component of it. But that's oftentimes it's certainly a part of defining our relationship to nature. Again, there's also an educational component that is very important in our relationship to nature. So what we learn about it from books or school or other sources, oftentimes helps define how we relate to nature. Again, not exclusively. It's not the only thing. Nature connection goes well beyond that, but it is a part of it. And when you add all of this together, and plus some of the other things that I'm going to talk about this evening, you end up with the actual connection part, okay? And there's specific practices, ways of being in nature, going out into nature, and how you engage your senses and just your overall, the way you carry yourself, your being, which is really the essence of the connection part of nature. And that's the part that is so much overlooked in our modern society. If you go back to more primitive cultures, the few that are remaining, they still have this. In many respects, though, they probably wouldn't tell you that. They wouldn't say it because to them it's just part of it, okay? They don't think of it in that terms because there's no other way of being, or there hasn't been. That's how they came out of the womb, having a connection to nature, and that's how, many of them, the elderly, obviously are going to leave the earth, okay? It's just a part of it. So they don't know anything different. But from our perspective, we've had to kind of bring this back into the fold because oftentimes it is absent. Okay, so what is nature connection? Okay, let's look at a few or a possible definition. Okay, and this is my definition. Other people would have different definitions, but I think this is a good starting place. And nature connection to me is the conscious state of feeling integrated with the natural world by engaging with one's senses, mental faculties, and intuition. It's all of that wrapped into one. Okay, and when we do that, we really form a strong bond with nature. It can be through many different types of activities, but it almost always involves all of that: your senses, your mental faculties, your knowledge, and your intuition, your deeper level of understanding. Okay, another way of looking at it or putting it out there is connection. You might think of it equals knowledge, which can be not only learned knowledge or in a book, but based on your own experience, plus your presence or your awareness. And I think oftentimes this again is what we overlook with the modern mind, the Western mind. We have so much going on in our head that many times we're out in nature, we're out in a beautiful place, and we're just oblivious to what's going on. We're not in the moment. And this is important, obviously, in many different endeavors, not just in nature, but it's a very common problem. I suffer from it as well, particularly if you're in a very, let's say, high stress environment, job, life, whatever it is. To go and just step outside, it usually doesn't just immediately drop out. You have to work at it. You have to practice and do some of the things I'm going to discuss to be able to get that presence back, to get that awareness. Okay? When you do, it's what I refer to as revelatory, because you then become in the know, if you will. You really become aware, conscious of what's going on around you, and that changes everything. One of the worst things I think you can do out in nature is to miss something that's going on and simply not be aware of it. And that's happened to me. Of course, when it usually happens to you, you're not aware of it. But if you have a couple of experiences where you're with some other people and maybe you're not present and they are, then it's a real aha moment, because you realize, oh, wow, I was drifting, I wasn't there, I hadn't leveled myself, and so I missed out on something which, really would have promoted my nature connection and the time that I was out there, okay? And I think the biggest benefit of that is that when you are able to do this, you begin to feel part of the story, okay? And in fact, we don't know it, but you always were part of the story. So my favorite nature story that I've ever heard is from a researcher named Klaus Zuberbuehler. And he was at the University of Scotland. He was doing primate research in Africa. I believe it was in the Ivory Coast, but it was somewhere in a dense forest. And he was researching primates and primate behavior and primate calls. Okay, he's an anthropologist. He wanted to look at their behavior compared to ours. And so in analyzing these calls, he started picking up and making recordings. This is several decades ago, of leopard calls. Okay, and one group of monkeys in particular, he was recording, and he couldn't really ascertain the call. He could hear it, but he had to go back in the lab, look at the acoustical signature. But after a time, he started recognizing that call, and he could differentiate it from other very similar calls. And he made all these other discoveries that other monkeys, there's 9 other species of primates that live in that area, and they could eavesdrop on each other's calls, and they depended on each other, and they had different calls for different threats, eagles versus leopards. The birds would make calls, the primates could listen into them, and vice versa. And he really unlocked this whole web, and that's astounding in and of itself. But what's more astounding is one day he was out and he was coming back from a long walk, and he heard this group of monkeys make a leopard call. And so he noted that, because he had learned how to recognize that. And then a few minutes later, he heard another troop of monkeys make the same leopard call. And then a few minutes later, another troop. And this happened about 10 different times, over the course of 20 minutes. And then after he heard the last troop call, things got quiet. And then he stopped and he realized what was going on. And that was that the leopard was following him. And it just changed everything. Now, at very first, he obviously became quite scared as he tells the story, and picked up a stick, which he kind of laughs at himself because it wasn't going to do much. But then after the shock wore off, and I think he realized that he was safe and the leopard wasn't going to attack him, he had this real aha moment, because now he understood what was going on. But even more important than that, he realized he was a part of the story, and he always had been. He just couldn't pick up on that story previously. And it was a very humbling experience that all these creatures were talking to him. And I liken it to if you grew up with a foreign family that spoke another language you couldn't understand. You went off to school, you learned that language, you came back, and then suddenly all these messages, like the mailman left a package at the door, or somebody tried to break into your house last night, or your brother was stealing your allowance, whatever it is. that you could tune into all that, how much you were missing. And that's the power of nature connection. So I think that's a great story. And as you start to do these practices, you can end up with your own stories like that as well. Okay. And again, one of the big things that you glean from that is that we're not separate from nature. We're still a part of it. Even with all of our tools and progress, we're still a part of it when we step outside. And we can actually tune into these messages because these animals are reacting to us, and we can react to what they're telling us. Okay. One other note on that is that when we start to develop nature connection or increase our nature connection and feel part of our surroundings, then there's not really this separation, and this idea of wilderness starts to fade in a way. Now, that's a modern term, wilderness, and I love wilderness because I think having those places are very important. Either where they're minimally managed by man. There may be people in there, or some cases there's no people at all, but they're wild places. But many native groups, Native Americans included, they didn't have a word for wilderness because they were just in it. They were always connected to it. And so it makes sense. Why would you have a word for something that, you're never separate from? Okay, it was just part of their ecosystem, if you will. And then last thing to note on this is that, and this has been shown quite recently, without any doubt, that in measuring skulls of past humans, somewhere in the neighborhood about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, and it corresponds exactly with the time that we moved into civilization. First we moved from hunter-gatherer to domesticating animals and being pastoral and agriculture, but then into civilization. And in that move to civilization, we actually lost a substantial size of our brain. It's about the size of a lime, is what they say. Okay, and there's a lot of debate about why our brains reduced in size, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we got dumber, but my own opinion is that I think it's actually probably quite obvious that a lot of the faculties we needed to do things that we talk about in artificial intelligence now, like pattern recognition and being able to take in what our senses give to us and interpret that, we've lost a lot of that. And actually, there's some theories that we depend on that information. We used to depend on our survival, and as either individuals or small groups, we had to have. You think of it like a giant computer. You had to process all the information yourself, whereas now in civilization, we can depend on many others around us from the civilization at large to provide us that information. So just something to note that if you want maybe a larger brain or a more capable brain, nature connection may very well help facilitate that. So this is a slide that John Young has used, and I really liked it because it just shows a variety of ways that you can connect to nature. Again, there's no one way to do it. There's many gateways or many avenues, okay, via the land, the water, but somehow you need to engage your senses. And, that can be with a variety of, wildlife. It can be with, trees and other flora, birds. It can even be from, engaging with what we call hazards of nature. Fishing or hunting certainly is a great way. The study and interaction of mammals, and when I say study, I mean things like actually, their behavior and watching them and engaging with them, and foraging as well. Also, just actually not just studying it academically, but ecology in terms of really watching it and being a part of it yourself, engaging with it. So there's no one way of doing it as long as we engage our senses. And so, you can have a lot of different interests. It's hard to do all of these, but I would suggest that you kind of start with something, utilize some of the practices I'm going to talk about in later slides, and then you'll start to develop that, and then you can expand into these other areas, and whatever you've learned in one area certainly will help you in the other areas as well. Let's look now at some ways to increase your connection to nature. Okay, so one of the theories or theorems I have is that the closer you are to hunter-gatherer type activities and the things that humans used to do thousands of years ago. I don't really like the word primitive myself because I think it has a negative connotation, but that's what's usually used when people talk about primitive skills. The higher then the degree of nature connection that you're likely to achieve, and I think the higher level of enjoyment that you're going to get from that. They just seem to go hand in hand. Another way of looking at that is that the less technology that you bring to bear when you are out in nature, generally speaking, the more satisfaction that you're going to have. And that's not to say that all technology is bad. I mean, obviously, if you're navigating an area you don't know, having a map and compass can be incredibly useful, right? Or a GPS device or whatever. But usually when we have technology or too much of it, two things happen. One is that we're not doing what we used to do on our own with our own brains, our hands, our legs, figuring stuff out. We're letting the tool do it. And oftentimes that reduces nature connection. And then the other thing, we're distracted. We're not paying attention to what's going on around us, and we can miss a lot. So I would just advise you that when possible, you can start with a little bit if you're, just don't feel comfortable. But if you are actually, leave your phone in your pocket, right? Or even better, leave it in your house if you're going to a local park. Don't do anything that's, dangerous or unsafe. But the less you have with you, generally the more you're going to get out of your nature experiences. And so then along with that, think in terms of, doing things with your body, your hands, making things rather than, relying on, any kind of accessory that can do it for you. So I mentioned here hand lining, which, I go fishing. I love fishing. I do rod and reel. I've done fly fishing as well. But I can tell you what, the few times I've caught fish like hand lining, just carrying a line in my hand along, let's say a bank, and I've caught a fish has been more enjoyable than really any other fish that I've caught. Okay. And, I haven't actually done this, but if you're into, fish baskets and you make a fish basket and you catch one yourself, that's probably even more rewarding. So I think the closer you get back to the simplest forms and the original practices, the more enjoyment you're going to get out of it. Okay. Another thing that you can do is use natural materials, okay, that you find or you're able to harvest in your area to achieve whatever you're trying to do. And there's just something about, again, when you create your own item that you're going to use, whatever you're doing in nature, that enriches the experience and promotes connection. So when we look at indigenous cultures, we'll see that they use what's referred to again as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, those practices, okay, to do whatever they needed to do to survive. But it also had this added benefit, okay? It promoted bonds between friends and family. And this was something that was, perhaps it should have been obvious to me, but when I started doing this with my family and my young kids, I was really surprised at just all the benefits of it. I mean, just relationally, it's a great bonding activity. We get to spend time together. They get to learn skills. It keeps them from maybe doing other activities which are more self-absorbed. And there's just a plethora of benefits, obviously just being outside. So that's something I think that, again, I want to emphasize. There's many aspects of this besides just your own individual benefits that you're going to get out of it. Okay. And then also remember, hearkening back to not that long ago, I mean, just several thousand years ago, again, all our ancestors were doing this. So literally, these type of practices are in your DNA. Okay, all of us have this in us, and we may not know the specific skills, but we can relearn those. Okay, and when we start doing them again, it just has this natural meditative effect on us, because I believe it's what we're meant to be doing, at least with the substantial portion of our time. One thing, I hate to say a word of caution, but just remember that A lot of our outdoor activities now, particularly like hunting and fishing, they can seem very extractive, and they're gauged oftentimes by the more or the bigger, right? The more fish, the bigger buck that you get. But with nature connection, oftentimes you're going to find two things. One, it's going to take longer to, in quotes, achieve what you're trying to achieve in terms of the outcome. But you're going to usually bring in less, okay? However, again, I find that it's far more rewarding. And because it's more rewarding, it's more memorable, right? You're going to think about it for years to come, okay? And so that's just something that, again, it kind of goes against the natural grain and what we see in advertising and in outfitter stores. But I think it's oftentimes a good reminder that, even though these practices may take longer, and you're not going to get as much out of it in one sense, you're going to get a lot more out of it in another sense. And then the other thing that I learned too when I started doing this is something I called an origin to end to origin experience, okay? Or you might just refer to as an end to end experience. But that's basically when you do something, an activity, with your hands, traditional primitive practice. Maybe you make something, right? A tool, an implement. You go and use it. You perform some task. You go out hunting or fishing, whatever it is, foraging. And then you actually take the bounty from that and you go back in, and that kind of feeds back into maybe the tool or whatever you were doing to begin with. And when you have that kind of end-to-end experience, it's just incredibly enriching. It's, you think of it, the sum is better than the individual parts. And I found that to be true over and over. So again, it will take longer, it's going to take more time, but you're going to get more out of it, even than the just individual practices. When you can put them together and have one experience all throughout, it's very, very rewarding. So here's just a few examples of actual nature connection activities or practices that I've done in a variety of situations, just to give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So that here is a bowl of acorn flour. Okay, so I went out with my daughter, connected a bunch of acorns during mass season, and then we went and peeled them. It's a time-consuming process. You have to take the outer shell off, of the acorn. Then you have to mash it up, and then acorns have tannins in them that are not very palatable and cause upset stomach. So you have to go and then leach it. You go through this process. You leach it multiple times. But at the end of it, you're left with this very tasty flour. You can do something similar if you happen to live in the South. You have mesquite trees and mesquite beans. All of those, you don't have to leach them. It's a simpler process. But then you can go and do anything with it. You can make pancakes. You can make cookies. And I tell you, when you eat that, you'll not only appreciate it more, but there's just something, it literally almost tastes better. Not to mention it's not a processed food, processed in the way that we think of processing when we buy something at the store. Here's another example. This is pine needle tea. So when I go back country camping or on a long backpack trip into the mountains, what I love to do at the end of the day, particularly when it's cold, I'm tired, I'm beat down, set up tent after a meal, just go and grab, a couple of small branches of look pine, or almost any conifer will work. Get the needles off. I like to cut them in half. Just bring some water to boil and drop them in there for a couple minutes and have some pine needle tea. It's just really refreshing. There's no caffeine in it, but it does very high in vitamin C. It's good for you. And it's just great drinking that right before you go to bed. It warms you up. So very good activity. This is something I did with my daughter here. I wanted to teach her a little bit about just kind of general survival principles, and because I know when she's older, at least I hope she does, goes out and spends a lot of time outdoors. So we built a little shelter. What I did is added a twist in there. Got one of her stuffed animals, and we put it under there. Built a little A-frame on top of it, and then lined it with some leaves and left it out in a rainstorm. And then, came out the next morning and saw that it was dry. And so she got to learn a valuable skill, but it was really a fun activity, and it was a learning activity. So that was just something that was great, and she really enjoyed. This is an example here of a blizzard that we had. We usually don't have much snow where I live, but we had a huge blizzard about 3 years ago, and got a big dump. Stayed that way for about 10 days and lost power. And so I just thought, well, I'm going to build a snow shelter. So I did that and actually ended up sleeping in it. And it was a great learning experience. It took about 8 hours to build, and I got to learn some as well about. I made some other shelters before, but this was a different situation, and just in my own yard, like having to go find different types of snow, some to use for the blocks, some to use for the mortar, packing some insulation in and the door. So it was a great thing, and I actually slept in it one night. It was just about, about 0 degrees Fahrenheit, but I was warm. I did kind of cheat and had a sleeping bag just to make my wife happy, but that was a great activity, really enjoyed. Here's another example. I do some hunting with a longbow, a self-made bow, and so when I go out sometimes and I'm doing let's say a brush blind or still hunting, I'll make my own camouflage. And where I live, it's really easy. We have a lot of limestone soils here, and what we refer to as caliche. It's just crushed limestone. You just mix that up with charcoal, varying parts, and you can get all kinds of colors from, an almost a black, really dark or olive color, olive green, to really light, yellow beige colors. Perfect for camouflage. Okay, so again, just gives you more of a connection to make your own rather than just, going into an outfitter and buying all the gear from them. This is an example here. My daughter had a little play kitchenette and had some little pine, in this case, a little box, which I've shown the original color here, as well as a little wooden spatula. So we went out and collected some walnuts, took out the outer skin on it, and then actually used it to stain the spatula. So that spatula was the same color as that box. And at first, when it went on, it was a yellow color, and then as it oxidized and aged over 2 or 3 days, it just turned in this beautiful walnut stain color. And I could have used this to stain a piece of furniture, or I wish I had done it with a bow. I had an instructor who had recommended this a few years ago, but I was really proud of that, if you will, rather than just going and buying some stain in the store. Again, nothing wrong with that, but if I had done that with a self-made bow, it really would have just added, I think, to the beauty for me of it. And here's an example here of that, making your own bow. And so even though I didn't use the stain on it, that's a longbow that I've made several of them now. And this is a self-made bow, and I go out and hunt with it and practice and show my kids how to shoot it. So again, nothing wrong with whether it's a longbow or a compound, what have you, but you just feel this real connection to it when it's yours and you made it with your own hands. Let's look now at a few specific skills that you can learn that I think are great to foster nature connection. You can do no matter where you live. You can start small. It doesn't require really anything in terms of equipment or know-how, in terms of to get going. And one of them is wildlife tracking. Okay, so this is something that I do and teach courses in, and it's just a wonderful nature connection practice because first of all, you learn what wildlife is in your area, but secondly, you learn about what they're doing, their behavior, what they're eating, where they're denning, where they're sleeping, where they're mating, where they're moving at various times of the year, other animals that they're interacting with. So just an absolutely great activity that you can do, and again, something you can do with your kids, friends, or family. Another one is bird language, and this is not a well-known discipline. Again, it's something I learned from John Young, but it's maybe my favorite activity because you can do it anywhere. You can do it even in a city. I have an office and I'm constantly talking to people, looking out the windows of 16th story about bird alarms that are going on and hawk attacks. And it's just a wonderful activity, but it greatly increases your awareness of what's going on in nature. And, again, birds will tell you this entire story. It's not like traditional birding where we're just focused on IDing a particular bird or their song, but it's actually about their intra and interspecies communication about everything that's going on, and particularly threats. And they have this amazing language that they communicate that humans have always have up until modern times tuned into and can learn again. And it'll tell you everything about animals moving, large and small animals, oftentimes what they're doing, if it's a predator, where food sources are, just all kinds of things. It's fascinating. I love it and just do it all the time. Again, another great activity to do with your kids or other friends or family. Wilderness survival skills. I recommend this for anybody who's spending any significant time in the backcountry because it's just so practical. It can obviously get you out of a potentially dangerous situation, even save your life. But also, they're just really fun, and you kind of get a connection not only to nature but back to our ancestors and what they had to do, right? And so they're also fun and they're just very engaging, and there's so many different skills that you can learn. But I think they're also just generally very rewarding. So I highly recommend those and have courses in those as well. And then the last one, I think that, again, you don't need any equipment to get started other than some information, and that is foraging. Okay, and again, all these skills certainly are true in that regard. Okay, but foraging, you can just learn about plants, but not only what you can eat and what not to eat, because that's the most important thing you need to learn originally is what's poisonous, but also where you can find these plants, what time of year to harvest them, how to prepare them afterwards, right? And so, again, it's just a great activity. And this is something, no matter your background, some people obviously aren't into hunting or fishing, but almost everybody is into, let's say eating fruits or nuts, right? And so, whether you're a kid or adult, almost any age, I started this with my kids when they were super young. I mean, obviously you have to be careful to, not teach them to eat something that could be poisonous and they're just going and tasting everything they get their hands on. But it's a great learning activity, and again, it just has this really meditative effect, and also can be very nutritious and very delicious at times. Let's take a look now at some recommended practices that promote a deeper connection to nature. So, when we're talking about nature connection and deepening that connection, we really have to start by looking at how most of us behave when we're outdoors. Okay, and that doesn't matter whether we're even in our backyard, local park, or out in a wilderness setting, is that our zone of disturbance is greater than our zone of awareness. And the effect of that is that animals tend to flee before you ever seen them. And so in this diagram, if you look here, you can see that this backpacker is, just kind of plowing along here. Maybe he's making noise, just not paying much attention. And there could be some animals. It could be maybe a, big buck ahead of him, or it could be, some sort of bird. Takes off before he even knows that they're there. Never sees them, maybe never knows that they were even in the area. And that's just because, he was sending out shock waves, in essence, that went beyond where he could detect what he was aware of. And when that happens, we obviously see less, we hear less, and it just overall, takes away from our experience. Even if we're not out hunting, let's say, it still means that we're not going to have as rich an experience. And perhaps most importantly, when we see less, we're not going to be able to connect the dots as much. And so our story of what's going on around us, our understanding, our contextual experience is going to be less. So ideally, what we have instead is that our zone of awareness is greater than our zone of disturbance, okay? And when that happens, when we're able to diminish our disturbance and expand our awareness, then we see and hear and just overall experience far more. And as this diagram shows, we can be there, and it doesn't mean that we can't be moving, but oftentimes it does mean that, we don't just blow through an area. We may see the deer before it runs off, or, notice the bird in the tree, what it's doing, feeding, and many other animal behaviors. And they don't even know that we're there oftentimes. Or if they do, they're at least not intimidated or scared of our presence and take off. So again, that's good because we get to see more, and we get more out of our trip, but we also develop a better understanding because we get to understand more what these animals are doing. We get to observe them. We get to see how they're interacting with each other. And so that all of that promotes nature connection and again enhances our outdoor experiences. So, how do we go about expanding our sphere of awareness and diminishing our zone of disturbance? Okay. Well, one of the ways to do that is what is referred to as the routine of invisibility. And so, what you can do to start this so that basically animals, I don't want to say aren't aware of your presence, but animals maybe don't know when you're in an area exactly, or certainly you don't come across as a threat, as a predator, and so they're less likely to take off, is that as soon as you go outside, and this could be right out your back door, or, again, step out of your car at a park, or certainly if you're in a forest or a wilderness setting, is that you want to quiet your mind and your body. Okay, again, you may be coming out of a situation where right out of work or some other stressful environment, and you've got all these thoughts running in your head. Your emotions are hyped up. Maybe your body is tense. We want to settle that down and bring the level down. Animals absolutely detect this. You can call it a sixth sense or whatever you like. But if we go out there all amped up, they're going to pick up on it. And again, we're just going to see and experience less. So one of the ways to do that is just to take a moment to pause and prepare your faculties, your senses, in order to increase your receptivity, okay? And again, lessens your disturbance. You also want to notice the current situation. Okay, so what's going on around you? What is the level of, let's say, bird activity or other animal activity? Or are they singing? Is there any kind of commotion going on or interaction, other movement? Or in contrast, is it completely silent? Are there other humans in the area? If so, what are they doing? What's the activity level? Or perhaps even some other machinery? We just want to take all of that in and note that. Okay, again, it's to create a baseline, if you will. And then we want to take stock of the environmental or the seasonal conditions, really both of them, okay? So, remind ourselves, hey, I'm in summertime, so, there's probably a lot of activity, animals feeding, or, I'm in winter, and animals are hibernating, or, whatever, they're sleeping, they're denning, whatever the case is. As well as, let's say, the weather. Is it cold? Is it rainy? Sunshine out, windy? What's the temperature? What time of day is it? That's very important as well because obviously, animals have cycles. Some are diurnal, some are nocturnal, some are crepuscular. We just want to make ourselves aware of that because that's going to affect what we see and what we experience. Another thing you can do that's highly effective is what's called a sense meditation, okay? And what we start with, or what I like to start with, because it's our our dominant sense for most people is vision, is what's referred to as owl eyes, okay? And so what we do is we want to stand as we step outside and gaze straight ahead, open our eyes really wide, and expand our vision to our full view, okay? Catching everything on the periphery all around us. We actually can see out 180 degrees both to the left and right almost, and almost not quite as much above and below us, but close to it, okay? Almost like a hemisphere if you want to think of everything around us as a sphere. And so we want to just pay attention to that and just sit with that for a second and see all the vision we can take in, okay, including or especially any sort of details and movement on the periphery, okay. Our vision, it's not as good as some other animals like hawks, but it actually is really good in terms of looking straight ahead. The periphery, it's not as detailed, but again, we can catch movement, and we actually just kind of focus on a spot in the distance, but also at the same time, while we're focusing, we can take in this information. It's really amazing what you can see, and that's just a good way to calibrate your vision. And then I like to move from there to something called deer ears, okay? And this is where instead of maybe thinking of hearing being passive, which is what we commonly do in our society, think of it actively where you send it out, like in every direction, okay? And unlike our vision, our hearing really does go in all directions, okay, like in a sphere all the way around us. So imagine just what you can send it out and then take back in, both in front of you and behind you, to the left, to the right, okay, and then try to pick out first, all the sounds generally speaking, but then try to differentiate really faint sounds, and particularly faint sounds in the distance. What can you pick out and distinguish from other sounds? Obviously, that's easier when it's very silent versus there's a lot of activity, but this is really useful. And the other thing you can do is just kind of slowly turn your head to the left or the right, because with our hearing, we can very easily differentiate what's to the left of us and to the right of us. It actually is hard to differentiate in many cases what's in front of us or behind us. And that's why owls actually have their ears they're not symmetrical. They're in different locations on their head, the left and the right. So if you turn to the left or the right, you can actually pick that up as well, and really differentiate what's in front and what's behind you. Then you can do something called dog nose, okay? And again, dogs have a very good sense of smell, just like deer have an excellent sense of hearing, and owls have an excellent vision, tremendous vision. Dogs have this great sense of smell. They have, so many receptors, particularly certain species, and I really should just say canines in general. And so they smell a lot better than we do, and we can't get to their level, but what we can do is just stop and inhale very deeply through our nose, okay? Take a deep breath in, and then kind of notice every nuance of odor that we can pick up or flavor, okay? And then actually once we do that, we can try to discern the intensity of that odor and maybe the direction it's coming from, the wind. Again, other animals are much better than humans are. We do not have a well-developed sense of smell. Myself in particular, my wife actually has a really good sense of smell. I don't so much. But still, even so, we can pick up on a number of smells. And so just helps calibrate and level set us. And then finally, you can do something called salamander skin. And salamanders have a really sensitive, detection on their skin, like a lot of amphibians do, which is why they're so sensitive to contaminants in the environment. And so you can imagine like you're an amphibian, like a salamander, and you've got this moist skin, and you can feel the wind. What direction is it coming from? What's the temperature? Does it feel clammy? Is it hot? Is it dry? Is it really cold? What's the humidity like? Is it high humidity? Do you feel any changes in the weather that's coming in if you do this for a few moments? And again, you can do this periodically in your time outside. It's good to recalibrate on occasion because it's just natural for us, particularly in the modern world, to kind of again disengage from our senses. So you can periodically go back to all four of these. So when you head outside and once you've done your prep work, you've calibrated your senses, you've really settled down and dropped in, then what do you do when you head down the trail? Well, what you can do actually to, again, lessen your disturbance and increase your awareness of what you see and experience is you can adopt what's called the lazy surveyor or waiter form, okay? And this is a relaxed posture, something John Young does, where you're just kind of walking really relaxed. You are upright, and you're not just totally bent over, but a slight bend in your knees, and you can imagine your shoulders and chest kind of held up by a coat hanger, but where your arms just kind of drop down. And this is important because one, it makes you relax, but two, again, animals just pick up on tension. So if they do see you, you look actually quite a bit different from, let's say, a stalking or a hunting animal. If you've ever seen a cat stalk, right? Obviously, it's a very different, very tense posture, right? This is the opposite of that, okay? And then you want to just kind of slowly move along, just kind of amble, and I recommend that you pause frequently just to take stock, look around, and particularly to look behind you. One of the mistakes that we often make is that we move forward, but we don't look behind us. And there's a lot of species that, as an example, will double back behind you. Deer commonly do this. Even snakes do it, actually. Snakes will oftentimes, particularly the first person, if you're in a group, they'll pass, and then they won't dart out until after that person has passed. What you don't want to do is that you don't want to stare, though. If you do see an animal, again, we're predators. We have binocular vision, eyes in the front here. And if you lock down on something, you're going to likely scare it off, okay? Another advantage of this, too, by the way, is in looking back and turning around, you're going to notice things that you didn't see. Could be other animal sign, all kinds of things. And it also helps keep you from getting lost because you see something from a different perspective. You can notice it. So it's just a good practice in general. The next thing you could do is what's called fox walking, okay? And that means as you're walking down, you're looking ahead. You don't look straight down. But what you do is you land on the outside of your foot. And this is hard to do when you're walking really fast, but if you're going a little bit slower gait, you land on the outside of each foot, and then you just kind of carefully roll under the ball of your foot. And this helps you avoid snapping any twigs or branches, okay? Again, we're bipedal organisms, so because of that, as we press down our foot, we have almost our entire weight on each foot as we take a step. And other animals who have four legs, and they actually can distribute their weight. Cats are a great example of this. They can lightly plant one of their feet and then wait to make sure that there's nothing under it, and then slowly put their weight on that. It's what makes them such great stalkers, right? So this is a way, I don't want to say to mimic that, but we can offset some of the noise that we typically make as humans by doing this. And then you can follow something called the honoring routine, and I highly recommend this. And that's where if you encounter animals in front of you, okay, your zone of, let's say, awareness has been greater than your zone of disturbance, and at least you haven't scared them off, even if they know that you're there, that rather than, again, staring at them and just kind of plowing through them, walking right through them, okay, turn to the side, don't look at them, turn to the side, kind of put your shoulders perpendicular to them, and then just kind of pause and wait, okay? And what you're signaling is that you're not hunting, you're not aftering, you're not trying to disturb them. And if they're feeding oftentimes, particularly their birds, they'll just kind of move off, or you can wait a minute. And if they don't move off, and again, you avoid this direct eye contact, you can, kind of yield the right away and go around them if necessary, if you can. I mean, it's not always possible. If you have to, you can kind of just shuffle forward quietly, again, not staring at them. And here's the big benefit of that. Even if, they kind of move out of the way and they don't really want to, what they're less likely to do is to shoot off, create an alarm, and notify everything else in the forest that you're there. And so it's both respectful, but it also does you a service as well. Again, in just having a better experience and being able to have more connection when you're out in nature. So here's another practice that I highly recommend, and that is to find a place to visit regularly. And that's because to really develop a deep connection to nature, okay, you have to have a repeated practice. Okay, and we've all had great nature experiences, I'm sure you have, of going out just one time in a mountain or a wilderness. But to really connect or to deepen your connection, you have to do something over and over. okay? And one of the ways you do that is to establish something called the sit spot. And this is basically an observation post, okay, where you can go out repeatedly and by observing learn what animals are doing, their overall behavior, what they're saying, the messages that they're broadcasting, either auditory or otherwise. Could be movements, whatever they're doing. Um, and learn from them over time. And that's just the best way, I think, to really establish nature connection. And it's based on this principle that everything is watching and listening all the time. Okay, all the other animals are doing that, and you should be too. I mean, that's how they got good at what they're doing. They're always paying attention because for them it's a life or death situation, right? To either eat or avoid being eaten. Okay, he also has a benefit, even if you're more a flora person than a fauna person, you get to watch over a period of time how plants are changing. Even if you're in a tropical habitat, you can still see how, new plants pop up or certain ones flower at particular times of the year or fruit or, certain ones are fed on certain times of the year. And so it's just, again, a way to develop a connection by doing this over and over. And so during that time, you want to familiarize yourself with all the individual behaviors, any interactions between whether it's the same species or different species, and just any patterns. And again, you can connect this to, the time of year, right? Or the temperature, the climate, time of day as well, okay? You can experiment with this. A lot of times it's best to go out at the same time of day when you're starting off, kind of get a baseline, and then you can change that, and then you can notice how it changes during the year. And during that, you want to just notice any other situations that arise, okay? And I like to take note of it, okay? I like to take notes, okay? And when you do that, you can piece this together over time, okay? And it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You can go and journal while you're out there. Some people like to map as well when they do this. And when you piece that together over time, again, you're able to extract the meaning out of it ultimately and really contextualize it. And that deep understanding, that deep meaning, I think is what ultimately leads to nature connection, right? And feeling part of a place. Because literally, even over time, if you go to the same sit spot, the birds, for example, start to recognize you. They start to know that you're there, or the other animals. And you start to feel part of a place. And that just adds to the overall experience and, where you become part of the story. So how do you go about finding an appropriate area to do your sit spot? Okay, well, here's what ideally you would look for in terms of the characteristics that you would like it to have. One is that it's close to where you work or live. And the reason for that is that if it's far away, you're just likely not to go there on a frequent basis, okay, or you're unlikely to go there on a frequent basis, okay. And again, this is all about having a repeated practice, right? Developing nature connection, it just happens as you do it more and more, okay? So you want it easy to access as well, okay? And the reason for that is that if you have to crawl through a bunch of brush or make a bunch of noise, you're creating a big disturbance, what's called disturbing baseline, and you're just a lot less likely to see other animals and other interactions because they're going to move off for whatever period of time, and it's going to lessen your overall experience. You also want to have, as much as possible, exposure to a lot of different animal species, birds, other small mammals, if you can, and even plants as well. The more diversity that you have, the better, generally speaking, because the more that's going to happen, right, when you're out there. And then also, you'd like to have it farther away from any kind of heavy activity from humans. And that may not always be possible, okay, particularly if you're in a city. But the more that you do have that distance, then the better off you're going to be because, again, animals, like typically speaking, some obviously are accustomed to heavy human activity, but many of them aren't and they're shy. And so you're going to see more of those if you get to an area that's less disturbed. Also, you want to look for an area that has plenty of resources, okay? So lots of food, water, cover for them to hide, okay? Again, that's just going to have more diversity, and also one that has a mixture of habitat, and particularly something called edge habitat. So ideally, if you live in an area that's forested, you may have trees up to a point, and then you have an open area. And that's kind of based on a principle called lax and larders. But in a nutshell, it's that animals are going to go where to different areas where there's different resources. And the forest has different resources than an opening does. Or a body of water next to a forest, next to an open area is actually ideal, okay? Because you're going to get a lot of diversity and there's a lot of different resources there. And then also, you'd like to find a place that has a large panorama where you have, a good viewscape, right? Just because you can see more, right? Things that happen, you can engage not only your auditory senses or smell or kinesthetic, but also you can actually see, and just going to add in, you're going to get more information in, which is going to add to your knowledge and understanding and your connection to nature. And then finally, I recommend sitting rather than standing, but you can stand, but you just want to, generally speaking, kind of conceal yourself as much as possible. Because again, animals oftentimes are scared of us. We're predators, particularly if they've been hunted. So if you're able to hunker down, maybe get a little bit of cover, underneath a tree or in front of some shrubs, wearing darker colors so you don't stand out for animals that do have color vision. Again, you're likely to see more when you do that. Okay, let's talk now about how you go to access your sit spot. So you want to quietly approach it, making as little impact when you go across the land as possible. Okay, so I mentioned about wearing darker colors, and again, we just don't want to alert other creatures to our presence unnecessarily, because that feeds into that whole thing about having our zone of awareness bigger than our zone of disturbance. And on your way out there, you want to notice the state of play. Okay, you want to see how animals are behaving, just in general, and also to your presence, and you're moving through the area. And typically that's going to be birds, but it could be other animals as well, even domesticated ones. Okay, then once you get there, just sit down quietly, and you want to wait a few minutes for things to settle down. Sometimes we call this the zero period, if you will, and hopefully let things return to baseline. Okay, and then just sit as long as you like. So it could be a few minutes, whatever you have, even up to an hour. Some people even do more than that. If you want, make observations, and or maybe just jot some notes and journal later. I don't recommend that you have your head buried into your notebook. Okay, and I generally recommend that you do this on pen and with pencil and paper. Pencil obviously is great because you can erase it. Some people prefer pen versus an e-device. It's just less distracting, I think, both to you and potentially to other wildlife. But whatever you do, just make a quick note and then go back to looking. You can carry binoculars with you and look through them, but the bottom line is you want to spend the majority of your time engaging your senses versus having your head buried in your notes. Okay? If you're there for a longer period of time, then I recommend you divide it into segments. Usually 5 to 10 minutes is a good idea, and you can number those, like periods 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then when you're finished, you just want to get up again quietly, kind of like doing everything in reverse, and exit making as little disturbance as possible, okay? Because you never know. You might see something on the way out. Something may have moved in while you were sitting there. And additionally, you want to train these animals that you're not a threat, that you're just, you're part of the landscape. You're coming in, doing whatever you're doing. You can even do something like you can stop a little bit, pick up something on the ground like you're feeding, and move off. You just want to fit in as much as possible. Okay, so when you're out at your sit spot, and really any time in nature, and you're observing things, you're engaging your senses, one of the ways that you can actually interpret what you're seeing, right, and have a better level of understanding, okay, which again promotes nature connection, is to do what's called primary and secondary perception. Okay, and I highly recommend this, okay? And primary perception is basically engaging your senses, and when information comes in, saying, what did I see? What did I hear? What did I notice? Really, in just purely objective terms, it's just the data. I saw a bird flying. I heard this noise, right? I saw this track that had this many toes, right? And it had this pad shape, okay? It's something that's measurable. And so, kind of by definition, if two people were to, experience the same thing, they could describe the same thing. They could go and take notes and compare, and it wouldn't be vastly different. Okay, it's independent of the observer. Okay, because it's objective. Okay, it's not subjective. It's not your opinion. It's not what you think about something or what you've even seen before. It's just the data, if you will. And one of the things, particularly in the Western mind, but humans in general, that we tend to do is jump to conclusions about what something means, right? And what it is. We want to label it. Okay, I do this all the time. And it's for our own survival, obviously, because, back in when we were out, hunter-gatherer, and, there were lions, tigers, whatever, other dangerous animals around, we had to make very quick judgments on whether something was dangerous or not to flee. Okay, so it does serve us well. I don't want to say it doesn't have its uses, but in many cases it can detract from what we're doing and in our nature connection. And oftentimes we're in error anyway, okay, and we come to a wrong conclusion. So try not to jump to conclusions and just hold off on that. Instead, pay attention to as many details as possible about what you're observing, okay, what you're seeing, all the aspects of it, okay, using all of your senses. And then if it's something that's continuing to happen, notice as it repeats, right? Any patterns or sequencing of events, okay? All the information related to that, okay? Cause and effect, whatever you can note on that, again, just in objective terms. So the next aspect of this, once we've done our primary perception, we want to engage what's called secondary perception. And as you can probably ascertain, this is the part where we utilize, like a scientist, like we're almost doing a scientific experiment, the data that we got from our primary perception, okay, to make a determination, to figure out, what was it that we experienced? What was it that we saw or heard or some event, okay? What caused it? Who or what thing was responsible for it? Or if it's a series of things, how are all these related? And that's where we engage basically our thinking, our intuitive faculties, okay, where we start to interpret, okay? This is where it is subjective, okay, and two people may come to very different conclusions, okay, in terms of what their overall judgment of a situation is or how they label an event, okay? And a big part of this is because it's based on our past experience and our past knowledge or just how our own brain works, right? On conclusions that we have. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is the time to do that, okay? The most important part, though, is that we want to utilize what we got in primary perception. Okay, we don't want to just go to a conclusion and dismiss all that data. We want to say, well, based on this and this and this and this, what corresponds to that? What event, what animal, makes sense that all these things happened, right? And then, or if we come to a conclusion, we want to go back and say, well, does that fit? I think it was this animal who made this track, right? Does that fit what the track features are here? Or, this particular bird behavior, does that fit, that particular bird? Whatever the situation is, okay? In this part of the analysis, it's okay to use your intuition, okay? I even say it's okay to anthropomorphize, okay? That's a long word, right? But in scientific circles, a lot of times you're browbeat for anthropomorphizing. But I think it's actually okay, and other people do too, where you guess and base it, on your own intuition, your own behavior. And I think part of the reason for that is that, as humans, we're still animals, right? And we have a lot of the same DNA, right? And so if a bird, as an example, seems like it looked in tension or it looked like it was in alarm, well, there's a good chance that it was if we felt that way as well. If we felt like something was threatening, okay, then we can maybe interpret that bird behavior the same way. So you can use your deductive reasoning because it's essential to figuring out these complex interactions. And you may not do it in one go, right? You may see something and take notes, and then you go back later and go, oh, that's what that was. Or you read or you look up something. But in many cases, you may not know for a long period of time. And it results in you having to ask more questions and experience the same thing again. And sometimes, not every case, but sometimes even years later, something similar will happen. Or you'll be talking to somebody or have some other experience, and then you'll go, oh, wow, that's what that was 3 years ago. And I tell you what, it's really rewarding when that happens. That's still a part of nature connection, even though it didn't happen at the time. It's linking back, and it's kind of piecing that together, right? Weaving that thread into the overall story. And so that's really valuable. So don't stop asking questions or following up, even if you don't understand at the time of the actual event.